I had rented the cabin for a week. The listing had described it as secluded, peaceful, perfect for an escape into nature. That was exactly what I was looking for. Time away from work, from noise, from people. A chance to clear my head. It was deep in the woods, far from town. The drive alone had taken nearly 2 hours, winding down narrow, unpaved roads. The last stretch had been nothing more than a rough dirt path, barely wide enough for my car. By the time I arrived, my tires were coated in dust, and my hands were tense from gripping the wheel. The cabin was small, just a single-story wooden structure with a slanted metal roof. A porch wrapped around the front, its railing worn and splintered. The windows were dark, reflecting nothing but trees. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, thick and silent. I stepped out of my car, stretching my stiff legs. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. I listened for a moment. No cars, no voices, no distant hum of civilization. Just the wind shifting through the trees, the occasional creak of the porch settling under its own weight. Perfect. I grabbed my bag from the trunk, climbed the wooden steps, and pushed open the cabin door. The inside was simple, wood-paneled walls, a stone fireplace, a small kitchen in the corner, a single bed against the far wall, covered in an old quilt. A narrow hallway led to a bathroom, its door slightly ajar. Everything was neat, clean, but old. The air inside was cool, carrying the faint scent of dust and dry wood. I dropped my bag on the bed and walked through the cabin, getting a feel for the space. The bathroom was small, with an old clawfoot tub and a mirror that had started to lose its silver backing. The kitchen had the basics: a stove, a fridge, a small set of cabinets. There was no TV, no internet, just silence. I liked it. I spent the rest of the afternoon settling in. I unpacked, put away the food I'd brought, and stepped outside to gather some firewood. The sun was already beginning to set, casting long shadows through the trees. As I knelt to pick up a fallen branch, I noticed something. Footprints. In the dirt near the tree line. Not mine. They were faint, partially covered by leaves, but they were there. Deep, large. I frowned, glancing around. No sign of anyone. I told myself they were old, maybe left by a hiker or a hunter passing through weeks ago. Still, I found myself looking over my shoulder as I carried the firewood back to the cabin. I stacked the wood near the fireplace, then locked the door. The old metal bolt slid into place with a dull clunk. I ate dinner by lantern light, the fire crackling in the hearth. Outside, the woods had gone completely silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just stillness. I went to bed early. Sometime in the night, I woke up. A sound, a slow, deliberate creak. The porch. I held my breath, listening. Another creak. Soft, cautious footsteps. I stared at the dark ceiling, my body rigid beneath the covers. Then silence. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. I didn't move. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I checked the porch. Nothing. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. But I knew what I heard. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe the cabin was just old, settling in the cold. I spent the day hiking. The woods were thick, dense, easy to get lost in. I followed a narrow deer trail, weaving through towering pines and tangled underbrush. The deeper I went, the heavier the air felt. At one point, I stopped to rest, and that's when I noticed it. The silence. Not just quiet, absence. No wind. No distant bird calls. No rustling leaves. Like the whole forest was holding its breath. I scanned the trees. Nothing moved. Then, from the corner of my eye, a shape. A figure. Standing deep in the trees, barely visible through the dense branches. Watching. I froze, my pulse hammering in my ears. I looked directly at it. It was gone. I stayed completely still, my hands clenched into fists. Then, the sounds returned. Birds chirping, wind shifting through the leaves. Had I imagined it? I turned back, moving quickly, my heart pounding. I reached the cabin just as the sun started to set. I locked the door, bolted the windows. The feeling stayed with me. I wasn't alone out here. That night, I kept the lantern on. I lay in bed, knife close, ears straining for any sound. For a long time, there was nothing. Then creak, the porch, a long pause, then soft footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving toward the door. My breath caught in my throat. The footsteps stopped. I gripped the knife, my pulse a wild drumbeat in my ears. Then, a single quiet tap against the glass of the window. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Seconds passed. Then nothing. I stayed awake until dawn. When morning came, I packed. I stepped onto the porch, my body tense. The woods were still. I walked to my car, scanning the trees. Nothing. Then, as I reached for the door handle, I saw them. Footprints. Fresh, deep, leading from the woods. Stopping at my window. I got in the car and drove. I didn't stop. Not until I was miles away. I never went back. I rented the cabin for the same reason most people do, to get away from everything. City life had worn me down. The endless noise, the crowds, the constant pressure. I needed silence. I needed space. When I found the listing, it seemed perfect. A small, off-grid cabin in the woods, miles from the nearest town. No internet, no cell service, no neighbors. Just trees, fresh air, and time to think. The drive out took longer than expected. The main highway was fine, but once I turned onto the back roads, things got rough. Narrow dirt paths, deep ruts, thick forest pressing in on both sides. My car's tires kicked up dust as I crawled along, checking the map every few minutes. The last stretch was the worst. A single-lane track winding through dense pines, barely visible. The kind of road that made you nervous about turning around because there was no room to do it. Then, finally, I saw it. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by tall trees. The wood was dark, weathered from years of exposure. A covered porch wrapped around the front, its railing worn and splintered. A small stack of firewood leaned against the side. No driveway, just grass and dirt. I parked and got out, stretching my stiff legs. The air was cool, damp with the scent of pine and earth. The only sound was the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. No birds. No animals, just stillness. I grabbed my bag and walked up the porch steps. The wood creaked under my boots. The key was exactly where the owner had said it would be, under the loose board next to the door. I unlocked the cabin and stepped inside. The interior was simple. One big open room plus a small kitchen and a bathroom. A wood-burning stove in the corner. A narrow bed against the wall, covered with an old quilt. A few shelves lined with dusty books and knickknacks. It smelled like old wood and dry air. I dropped my bag and walked through, getting a feel for the place. The kitchen had a propane stove and a small fridge that ran off a generator. The bathroom was basic, a toilet, a sink, a tiny shower stall. No mirrors. I noticed that right away. I shrugged it off. I spent the rest of the afternoon settling in. I stacked some firewood inside, unpacked my food, checked the generator. By the time the sun started to set, I was exhausted. That's when I noticed it. The feeling, like I was being watched. It was small at first, just an itch at the back of my neck. A sense that something was off. I told myself it was just the isolation, the unfamiliar silence. City nerves. But as I stood on the porch, looking out at the trees, the feeling got worse. The forest was too still. No wind,
No birds.
no movement, like the whole world was holding its breath. I turned back inside and locked the door. That night, I woke up to a noise, a soft, rhythmic tapping. I lay still, listening. It was coming from the window. I didn't move. My breath was slow, shallow. Then it stopped. I stared at the ceiling, heart hammering. Maybe a branch? Maybe an animal? I forced myself to breathe, to close my eyes. Eventually, I fell asleep. The next morning, I checked outside. Nothing.
No fallen branches.
No animal tracks near the cabin. But the feeling hadn't left. I spent the day hiking, trying to shake it. The woods stretched endlessly in every direction, thick and overgrown. The deeper I went, the heavier the air felt. At one point, I stopped to rest. And that's when I saw it. A shape, deep in the trees, barely visible through the undergrowth. Still, watching, my skin crawled. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then it was gone. I turned back, walking faster now. My legs burned, my lungs tight. I reached the cabin just as the sun started to dip behind the trees. I locked the door, checked the windows. I built a fire, even though the air wasn't cold. The warmth, the light, it made me feel safer. That night, I barely slept. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke up to something else. A sound, not tapping, footsteps, soft, deliberate, circling the cabin. I held my breath, my body rigid under the blankets. The footsteps stopped. Then a slow, quiet creak. The porch. My hands clenched into fists. Seconds stretched into minutes. Then finally, nothing. I stayed awake until the sun rose. The next morning, I made a decision. I packed my bag. I wasn't staying another night. I stepped outside, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. The forest was still. I walked to my car, threw my bag inside, and grabbed the key from my pocket. That's when I saw them. Footprints, fresh, leading from the woods, stopping just outside my window. My stomach dropped. I got in the car and locked the doors. The engine roared to life, loud in the silence. As I backed up, my eyes flicked to the trees one last time. That's when I saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the clearing, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I drove until the cabin was nothing but a bad memory. I never went back. I rented the cabin because I needed to be alone. I wasn't running from anything, not exactly. But life had gotten to be too much. The city, the noise, the expectations. I needed silence, space to think. I had always liked the woods. Something about the quiet felt right, like the world made more sense out here. I found the listing online. It was an old hunting cabin, tucked deep in the valley, miles from the nearest paved road. The ad had been short, rustic, off-grid, perfect for solitude. That was all I needed to hear. I booked it for a week. The drive was long, winding through back roads that got worse with every turn. The last stretch wasn't really a road at all, just a narrow dirt path, barely visible under the overgrowth. Trees pressed in close on both sides, their branches reaching like fingers. My car's tires kicked up dust as I crawled along, checking the GPS every few minutes. No signal. I wasn't surprised. The listing had warned about that. No internet, no cell service. Just me and the woods. Eventually, the cabin came into view. It sat at the edge of a clearing, backed up against a thick wall of trees. The wood was dark, weathered from years of rain and wind. A porch wrapped around the front, its railing cracked and splintered. The windows were dark. I parked and got out, stretching my legs. The air was cool, thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. I grabbed my bag from the trunk and walked up the porch steps. The boards creaked under my weight. The key was where the owner had said it would be, under the loose board near the door. I unlocked the cabin and stepped inside. The air was stale, carrying the faint scent of dust and old wood. The inside was simple. One big open room plus a small kitchen and a bathroom. A fireplace in the corner. A narrow bed against the wall, covered in a faded quilt. A wooden table with 2 chairs. A few shelves lined with old hunting magazines and dusty tools. Felt untouched, like no one had been here for a long time. I dropped my bag and walked through, getting a feel for the place. The kitchen had a propane stove, a tiny fridge. The bathroom was basic, a toilet, a sink, a shower stall with a curtain drawn tight across it. I hesitated, then pulled the curtain back. Empty. I exhaled, shaking my head. I was being stupid. I went back to the main room and started unpacking. I set my food in the fridge, stacked some firewood near the fireplace. By the time I was done, the sun was starting to set. The trees outside cast long, reaching shadows across the clearing. That's when I noticed it, the feeling, like I was being watched. It was small at first, just an itch at the back of my neck, a sense that something was off. I told myself it was just the isolation, the unfamiliar silence. But as I stood on the porch, looking out at the trees, the feeling got worse. The forest was too still.
No birds.
No animals, just silence. I turned back inside and locked the door. That night, I woke up to a noise, a soft, rhythmic tapping. I lay still, listening. It was coming from the window, slow, deliberate. I didn't move. My breath was shallow, my body frozen. Then it stopped. I stared at the ceiling, heart hammering. Maybe a branch? Maybe an animal? I forced myself to breathe, to close my eyes. Eventually, I fell asleep. The next morning, I checked outside. Nothing.
No fallen branches.
No footprints near the cabin. But the feeling hadn't left. I spent the day hiking, trying to shake it. The woods stretched endlessly in every direction, thick and overgrown. The deeper I went, the heavier the air felt. At one point, I stopped to rest, and that's when I saw it. A shape, deep in the trees, barely visible through the undergrowth. Still, watching, my skin crawled. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then it was gone. I turned back, walking faster now. My legs burned, my lungs tight. I reached the cabin just as the sun started to dip behind the trees. I locked the door, checked the windows. That night, I barely slept. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke up to something else. A sound, not tapping, footsteps, soft, deliberate, circling the cabin. I held my breath, my body rigid under the blankets. The footsteps stopped. Then a slow, quiet creak. The porch, my hands clenched into fists. Seconds stretched into minutes. Then finally, nothing. I stayed awake until the sun rose. The next morning, I made a decision. I packed my bag. I wasn't staying another night. I stepped outside, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. The forest was still. I walked to my car, threw my bag inside, and grabbed the key from my pocket. That's when I saw them. Footprints, fresh, leading from the woods, stopping just outside my window. My stomach dropped. I got in the car and locked the doors. The engine roared to life, loud in the silence. As I backed up, my eyes flicked to the trees one last time. That's when I saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the clearing, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I drove until the cabin was nothing but a bad memory. I never went back. I rented the cabin because I wanted to be alone. I wasn't running from anything, not exactly. I just needed a break from people, from noise, from the weight of everything. The idea of spending a week in the woods, away from emails and notifications, sounded perfect. The listing was simple: rustic off-grid cabin, secluded, no cell service, No internet. That was exactly what I wanted. A place where I didn't have to answer to anyone. A place where I could sit with my thoughts, with no distractions. The drive out took longer than I expected. The highway was fine, but once I got onto the smaller roads, things got rough. I followed the directions carefully, but the last few miles were nothing more than a narrow dirt trail winding through thick trees. My car jolted over deep ruts. Branches scraped against the sides. There was no turning back, not unless I wanted to reverse all the way out. Then finally I saw it. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines. The wood was dark and weathered, the windows shut tight. A narrow porch wrapped around the front, its railing warped with age. There was a small shed off to the side, half hidden in the trees. No driveway, just packed dirt. I parked, stepping out into the silence. And that was the first thing that struck me, how quiet it was.
No birds.
No wind, just stillness. I grabbed my bag from the trunk and walked up the porch steps. The wood creaked beneath my boots. I found the key under a loose board, just like the owner had said. The lock clicked, and I pushed the door open. The inside was just as simple as the photos had shown. One big room plus a tiny kitchen and bathroom. A fireplace in the corner. A bed against the wall, covered in a faded quilt. A wooden table with a single chair. Shelves lined with dusty books and rusted tools. The air smelled stale like old wood and dust. I dropped my bag and walked through the space, checking everything. The kitchen had a propane stove, a small fridge. The bathroom was basic, a toilet, a sink, a shower stall with a curtain drawn tight across it. I hesitated, then pulled the curtain back. Nothing. I exhaled. I was being stupid. I went back to the main room and started unpacking. By the time I finished, the sun was dipping below the trees. The shadows outside stretched long and dark across the clearing. That's when I felt it. A prickle at the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I turned, scanning the trees. Nothing, just silence. I shook it off and locked the door. That night I woke to a sound.
All soft, deliberate top, top, top.
I lay still, breath shallow. It was coming from the window. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then silence. I waited, staring at the ceiling. My heart pounded against my ribs. Minutes passed. Nothing. Eventually, I forced myself to close my eyes. I told myself it was just a branch or maybe an animal. But when I checked outside the next morning, there were no branches near the window.
No footprints.
Just undisturbed dirt. The feeling didn't leave. That day, I went for a hike, trying to shake the unease. The woods stretched endlessly in every direction, thick and overgrown. I followed a narrow deer trail, my boots crunching over dry leaves and twigs. A few miles in, I stopped to rest. That's when I saw it, a shape deep in the trees. Still, watching, my stomach turned to ice. I didn't move, didn't blink. Then it was gone. I turned back, walking faster now. My legs burned, my lungs tight. I reached the cabin just as the sun dipped below the treetops. I locked the door, checked the windows. That night, I barely slept. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke up to something else. A sound, not tapping, footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. My body went rigid under the blankets. The footsteps stopped. Then a soft, quiet creak. The porch. I clenched my hands into fists, forcing myself to breathe. Minutes passed. Nothing. I stayed awake until the sky turned pale. By morning, I had made my decision. I wasn't staying another night. I packed my bag, my hands shaking. I stepped outside, scanning the treeline. Nothing moved. The forest was still. I walked to my car, threw my bag inside, and grabbed the key from my pocket. That's when I saw them. Footprints, fresh, leading from the woods, stopping just outside my window. My stomach dropped. I got in the car and locked the doors. The engine roared to life, loud in the silence. As I backed up, my eyes flicked to the trees one last time. That's when I saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the clearing. Watching. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I drove until the cabin was nothing but a bad memory. I never went back. I needed to be alone. That was the whole point of the trip. A week away from everything: work, emails, traffic, people. Just me, the woods, and nothing else. I had found the cabin through a classified ad. The listing was brief. Small off-grid cabin for rent. No cell service. No electricity. Secluded. Good for hunting or solitude. That was all I needed to hear. I booked it immediately. The drive out took longer than I expected. The roads got worse with every turn. First pavement, then gravel, then a narrow dirt path winding through thick trees. My car jolted over deep ruts, branches scraping against the windows. I kept checking the GPS, but after a while, I lost signal entirely. The last mile felt endless. Trees pressed in on both sides, and the sun was starting to dip lower. But then, finally, the cabin appeared. It was smaller than I expected, tucked into a clearing at the base of a hill. The wood was dark and weathered, the roof sagging slightly. There was a narrow porch with a single rocking chair, its paint peeling. To the side, a rusted metal shed sat half buried in weeds. No driveway, just dirt. I parked and got out. The silence hit me first. No wind.
No birds.
Just stillness. I walked up to the porch, my boots creaking on the old boards. The key was under a loose plank, just like the owner had said. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air smelled stale, dust, wood, and something else. Something faint. The inside was as simple as I expected. One open room with a fireplace, a narrow cot against the wall, and a wooden table with a single chair. The kitchen was barely a kitchen, just a counter, a sink with a hand pump, and an old propane stove. A small bathroom with a toilet and a rusty shower stall. I set my bag down and exhaled. It was exactly what I wanted. Just me and the quiet. That night, I woke up to a noise.
A soft top, top, top.
I lay still, heart pounding. It was coming from the window. Slow, deliberate. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then silence. I stared at the ceiling, my pulse hammering in my ears. I told myself it was just a branch, maybe an animal. I forced my eyes shut. Eventually, I drifted off. The next morning, I checked outside. No branches near the window.
No footprints.
Just undisturbed dirt. The air felt heavy, like something was watching. But when I scanned the tree line, nothing moved. I spent the day hiking, trying to shake the feeling. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction. I followed a narrow trail, my boots crunching on dry leaves. The deeper I went, the more I noticed the silence.
No birds. No insects.
Just me and the trees. A few miles in, I stopped to rest. And that's when I saw it. A shape, deep in the woods, barely visible through the trees. Still, watching, my stomach turned to ice. I didn't move, didn't blink. Then it was gone. I turned back, walking faster now. My legs burned, my lungs tight. I reached the cabin just as the sun dipped behind the trees. I locked the door, checked the windows. That night, I barely slept. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke up to something else. A sound, not tapping, footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. I held my breath, my body rigid under the blankets. The footsteps stopped. Then a soft, quiet creak. The porch, my fingers clenched into fists. Minutes stretched into hours. Then finally nothing. I stayed awake until the sun rose. The next morning I made a decision. I packed my bag. I wasn't staying another night. I stepped outside, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. The forest was still. I walked to my car, threw my bag inside, and grabbed the key from my pocket. That's when I saw them. Footprints, fresh, leading from the woods, stopping just outside my window. My stomach dropped. I got in the car and locked the doors. The engine roared to life, loud in the silence. As I backed up, my eyes flicked to the trees one last time. That's when I saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the clearing, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I drove until the cabin was nothing but a bad memory. I never went back. I should have turned around when I saw the road. It was nothing but a narrow dirt path cutting through the dense forest, barely wide enough for my truck. The trees pressed in on both sides, their bare branches scratching at the sides like fingers reaching in. The road was supposed to lead to a secluded rental cabin deep in the woods, but it looked more like a forgotten logging trail. I had booked the place for a full week. 7 days of solitude, no cell service, and nothing but the sound of wind through the trees. It was exactly what I needed after the last few months. Life back home had turned into something I couldn't deal with anymore. Work was unbearable, stress piling on top of stress, and my apartment felt more like a prison than a home. I needed to get away, somewhere quiet, somewhere far from everything. The cabin was listed as isolated, rustic, and perfect for disconnecting. The pictures showed a solid wooden structure nestled between towering pines, a wide porch overlooking a clearing, and a small lake a few minutes' walk away. It seemed perfect, but as I drove deeper into the forest, following the GPS on my dashboard, doubt started creeping in. The road was rough, littered with potholes and fallen branches, forcing me to slow to a crawl. The trees blocked out most of the afternoon light, and the further I went, the more it felt like I was being swallowed by the woods. I hadn't seen another car in miles. Eventually, the cabin appeared at the end of the road. It looked just like the pictures, a simple log structure with a slanted roof, a stone chimney, and a wraparound porch. But something about it felt off. I don't know why. Maybe it was the way the woods seemed to press in around it, or how still everything was. No birds, no wind, just silence. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. My phone had lost service about an hour ago, and I realized then just how alone I was. I stepped out, stretching my legs, the dirt crunching under my boots. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. The key was supposed to be in a lockbox beside the door, and after some struggling with the rusted numbers, I finally got it open. Inside, the cabin was as simple as I expected. Wooden floors, exposed beams, a stone fireplace, and a few pieces of old furniture. There was a small kitchen with a gas stove, a worn-out couch near the fireplace, and a single bedroom in the back with a narrow bed and a dresser. No TV, no Wi-Fi, just a battery-powered radio sitting on the kitchen counter. The first thing I did was check the windows and doors. It wasn't paranoia, just habit. I made sure the locks worked, that there were no broken latches, nothing that could be forced open. Satisfied, I set my bags down and started unpacking. I had brought enough supplies to last the week. Canned food, bottled water, a few paperbacks, and a hunting knife, just in case. I wasn't expecting trouble, but out here alone it was better to be safe. By the time I finished, the sun was dipping below the trees. The cabin had no electricity, just a few oil lamps and an old flashlight I found in one of the drawers. I lit one of the lamps, its flickering glow casting long shadows across the walls. That first night I barely slept. The forest outside was too quiet. I kept waking up, listening for something, anything, but all I heard was my own breathing. Every creak of the cabin felt too loud, like something moving just out of sight. The next morning, I forced myself to shake it off. I wasn't used to being this isolated, that was all. I spent the day exploring, following a narrow trail down to the lake. The water was still, dark, reflecting the sky like glass. I sat on the shore for a while, letting the silence sink in. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was already setting. That's when I noticed the first sign that something was wrong. The front door was open. I was sure I had locked it. I remembered checking, testing the handle before leaving. But now it hung slightly ajar, just enough for a sliver of darkness to creep through. I stood there, heart pounding, staring at that open door. I told myself the wind must have blown it open, but there was no wind. The air was still heavy. Slowly, I stepped inside. Nothing looked out of place. My bags were where I left them, the cabinets closed, the furniture undisturbed. I checked the back door locked, the windows shut. Everything was as it was before. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been inside. That night, I kept my knife within reach. I barely slept, every noise making me jolt awake. The next day, I searched the cabin from top to bottom. There was no sign of forced entry, no footprints in the dirt outside, nothing to suggest someone had been there. But that night, I woke up to a sound, a soft creak just outside my window. I lay there, frozen, barely breathing. Then another sound, a slow, deliberate step on the porch. I gripped my knife, my pulse hammering in my ears. The sound of footsteps moved toward the door, then stopped. I waited, every muscle tensed. Minutes passed, then nothing. No retreating footsteps, no rustling in the trees, just silence. I stayed awake until dawn, my eyes locked on the door. By morning, I had made my decision. I wasn't staying another night. I packed my things, double-checking the locks before heading to my truck. But when I turned the key, the engine wouldn't start. I tried again. Nothing. The battery was dead. I hadn't left the lights on. I hadn't done anything to drain it. It was fine yesterday. I popped the hood, checking the connections, but I wasn't a mechanic. The truck wasn't going anywhere. Panic started creeping in. I had no service, no way to call for help. The nearest town was miles away, and I had no idea which direction to go. I decided to wait until morning, then hike back down the road. That night, the noises came again. Footsteps, closer this time. A slow, deliberate movement just beyond the walls. Then scratching, not at the door, at the window. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just listened. The scratching stopped. Then, a slow, steady pressure against the window pane. Something was outside, watching. I gripped the knife, my fingers slick with sweat. The pressure against the window eased. The footsteps receded, but I didn't sleep. At first light, I grabbed my pack and left the cabin behind. I walked for hours, my legs aching, my throat dry. The road twisted through the trees, endless. Then, finally, I saw movement ahead. A truck. I ran, waving my arms, shouting. The driver, a middle-aged man with a weathered face, pulled over. I didn't tell him everything, just that my truck broke down, that I needed a ride to town. As we drove away, I glanced back once. Through the trees just beyond the cabin, I saw it. A figure, standing perfectly still, watching, and then it was gone. I never went back, and I never will. I booked the cabin because I wanted silence. Real silence. The kind you only get when you're miles away from people, from traffic, from the endless background noise of life. I didn't just want it. I needed it. It had been a bad year. I won't get into everything, but I felt like my life had been caving in for months, piece by piece, and I couldn't take it anymore. Work had drained me. My apartment felt like a cage, and every day I woke up feeling heavier, like something was sitting on my chest. I needed to be alone for a while, away from everything. So I rented a cabin deep in the woods, a place where no one could reach me. The drive took longer than I expected. The cabin was way off the main road, and the path leading to it was more of a dirt trail than an actual road. The further I drove, the more I felt like I was leaving the world behind. Trees crowded in on both sides, tall and thick, the sky barely visible through the branches. My GPS had lost signal a while ago, but I had written down the directions before I left. By the time I pulled up in front of the cabin, the sun was already dipping low. The place was exactly how it looked in the pictures. Small, made of rough wood, with a slanted roof and a porch that sagged slightly in the middle. A single window faced the front, dark and empty. It looked abandoned, which was exactly what I wanted. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, listening to the stillness. No cars, no voices, not even the sound of wind. Just silence. I stepped out, stretching my legs. The air smelled like damp earth and pine. The key was in a lockbox beside the door, just like the rental listing had said. It took me a minute to get the rusted numbers to turn, but eventually, the box clicked open. Inside, the cabin was simple. A small kitchen with a gas stove, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a couch that looked like it hadn't been used in years, and a stone fireplace. The bedroom was in the back, just a narrow bed and a dresser. No TV, no Wi-Fi, no cell service. Just a battery-powered radio on the kitchen counter. I dropped my bag on the bed and walked through the place, checking the doors and windows. The locks worked. The back door had a deadbolt, which I slid into place. There was a slight chill in the air, so I decided to make a fire. The woodpile outside was stacked high, dry, and ready to use. Took me a few tries, but eventually, I got the fire going. That first night, I didn't sleep well. The quiet was too deep, too unnatural. I kept waking up, listening to the creaks of the cabin, the occasional rustle outside. I told myself it was just the woods settling, branches shifting in the wind, animals moving through the brush. But it didn't feel like that. Felt like something was out there. The next morning, I forced myself to relax. I was just being paranoid. I made some coffee on the old gas stove, sat on the porch and watched the trees. The sun was bright, the air crisp. Felt good to be out here, away from everything. I spent the day exploring. There was a trail behind the cabin that led deeper into the woods. I followed it for a while, stepping over fallen logs, listening to the distant sound of a stream somewhere nearby. The forest was thick, the trees packed close together, their trunks rough with age. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of movement. A squirrel darting up a tree, a bird flitting between branches. After a couple of hours, I turned back. I hadn't gone too far, but I didn't want to risk getting lost. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The front door was unlocked. I was sure I had locked it. I remembered turning the key, checking the handle before I left. But now it hung slightly open, just an inch. I stood there, heart pounding. Maybe I had forgotten. Maybe I had been in a rush and didn't close it all the way. I stepped inside slowly, my breath shallow. Nothing looked out of place. My bag was still on the bed, my jacket draped over the chair where I left it. The kitchen was the same. The fire had burned down to embers, but that was normal. Still, I checked everything. The back door locked, the windows shut. I tried to push the unease away, telling myself I was just being jumpy. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, I made sure to lock the door, double-checking it before going to bed. I kept my hunting knife within reach just in case. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. A noise, something moving outside. I held my breath, straining to listen. Soft footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate. My mouth went dry. I reached for my knife, gripping the handle tightly. The footsteps stopped. The cabin was silent again. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just listened. Minutes passed. Then the footsteps moved again. Slowly, they faded away into the trees. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed my things quickly, shoving everything into my bag. When I stepped outside, the forest felt different, too still, like it was waiting. I climbed into my truck and turned the key. The engine didn't start. I tried again. Nothing. The battery was dead. My hands tightened on the wheel. I hadn't left the lights on. I hadn't done anything to drain it. It had been fine yesterday. I climbed out, checking under the hood, but I wasn't a mechanic. I had no idea what was wrong. Panic started creeping in. I had no service, no way to call for help. The nearest town was miles away. I had two choices: stay and wait or start walking. I grabbed my backpack, stuffed some water bottles inside, and started down the road. The trees loomed on both sides, tall and silent. I walked for hours. My legs ached. My throat was dry. The sun started dipping low again, the shadows stretching long across the road. Then I saw it. Footprints in the dirt. Not mine. Fresh. Leading back toward the cabin. Someone had been following me. I stopped, heart pounding. Then, from the trees, a figure stepped out. Tall, thin, wearing dark clothes. I didn't stop to think. I turned and ran. Branches whipped at my face, my feet slipping on loose dirt. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I ran until my legs gave out, until my lungs burned. And then, finally, I saw it. A truck, parked at the edge of the road. I stumbled toward it, waving my arms. The driver, a man in his 60s wearing a worn-out jacket, rolled down the window. I barely got the words out. My truck was dead. I needed a ride. He nodded, told me to get in. As we drove away, I turned for one last look. Back down the road, in the fading light, the figure was standing there, watching. I never went back. I never found out who it was. And I don't want to. I hadn't planned on staying in the cabin. It was just the only option. The place was tucked deep in the woods, way off the main road. I found it through some off-the-grid rental site, one of those listings with just a few pictures and a vague description.
Secluded, peaceful, no neighbors.
That last part was what sold me. I needed space. No people.
No noise.
Just a week alone, away from everything. The drive up was rough. The road turned from pavement to gravel, then to dirt. My car bounced and shuddered over potholes, and tree branches scraped against the sides. The further I went, the more it felt like I was leaving the world behind. My GPS stopped working about halfway up, and there was no cell service. I wasn't worried. I had saved the map beforehand, and the directions were simple. Keep going straight until you hit the clearing. When I finally pulled up, the cabin was smaller than I expected. One story, just a rectangle of wood with a pitched roof. A single window on the front, a covered porch, and a door that looked like it had been patched up more than once. The trees around it were thick, pressing in from all sides. I turned off the car and sat there for a moment, listening. Nothing. No wind.
No birds.
Just silence. I stepped out, stretching my legs. The air was cool, damp, smelled like moss and wet wood. The ground was soft under my boots, littered with fallen leaves. The only sound was the faint ticking of my engine as it cooled. I grabbed my bag and headed inside. The key had been left under a loose board on the porch, just like the listing said. The lock was old and stiff, but after some jiggling, it turned. The door groaned as it swung open. Inside, the cabin was bare bones. A small kitchen to the right, just a sink, a propane stove, and a dented old fridge. A single counter with a few cabinets above it. To the left, a narrow bed pushed against the wall, covered in a thin, scratchy blanket. A wood stove in the corner, a chair beside it.
No TV, no radio.
Just a single overhead light and a bare wooden floor. I set my bag down and checked the fridge. It was empty. The listing had mentioned that bring your own food. I had packed plenty. Canned goods, bread, peanut butter, some instant coffee. Enough to last a week. I tried my phone. No service as expected. That was fine. That was the point. I spent the first few hours settling in. Unpacked, stacked some firewood next to the stove, checked the windows. The glass was old, slightly warped. The locks worked, but they felt flimsy. As the sun started to set, the light inside turned a dull orange. I lit a few candles and started a fire. The warmth spread quickly, pushing back the damp chill. Outside, the woods darkened fast. The trees turned into a solid black wall, impenetrable. I ate a simple dinner, then sat in the chair by the stove, listening to the fire crackle. That was when I first heard it. A sound outside, a soft rustling, like footsteps through leaves. I froze, listening. It stopped. Probably an animal. A deer, maybe. There were no bears around here, at least none that I'd heard of. I waited a while longer, then shook it off and went to bed. But sleep didn't come easy. The silence was too heavy. I wasn't used to it. Every tiny creak of the cabin sounded too loud. Every gust of wind against the roof made me tense up. I kept thinking about that sound outside. I finally drifted off sometime after midnight. And then, at some point in the night, I woke up. Something had changed. The fire was out, leaving only a faint orange glow in the ashes. The cabin was ice cold, and there was a sound. Not outside, inside. A slow, deliberate creak of wood. The kind a floorboard makes when someone steps on it. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The sound came again, closer. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint it. Then nothing. Silence. I waited. A minute. Two. Nothing. Slowly, I reached for my flashlight, clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, sweeping over the room. Empty. The chair by the stove. The tiny kitchen. The door still locked. The window. The latch was undone. I was sure I had locked it. I got up, heart pounding, and clicked it back into place. Checked the door again. Still locked. I told myself I must have forgotten the window, that I was just being paranoid. But I didn't sleep after that. The next day, I walked around the cabin, looking for footprints. The ground was damp, perfect for holding tracks. But I didn't see anything. No signs of movement. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, I barricaded the door with the chair, stacked some firewood against the window. At some point, I must have dozed off. And then I woke up. The chair had moved. Just an inch. But enough. I stared at it, heart hammering. Then, from outside, a sound. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Right outside the window. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. And then a hand. Pressing against the glass. Just for a second. Then gone. I don't remember grabbing my bag. Don't remember unlocking the door. I just ran. Out into the dark. Branches whipped against my face. Roots caught my feet. But I kept going. Blind. Desperate. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I fumbled for the keys, hands shaking. Jammed them into the ignition. The engine roared to life. Headlights cut through the trees. And in that beam, a figure. Standing just at the edge of the woods. Watching. I didn't wait. I hit the gas and didn't look back. I don't know who they were, what they wanted, but they had been in the cabin. And they weren't alone. Because as I sped away, I saw them. More figures. Standing just beyond the reach of my headlights. Still. Silent. Watching. I never went back. Never told anyone. But sometimes at night, I think about that hand on the glass. And I wonder, how long had they been watching? I don't know why I went back. I told myself it was just a trip to clear my head, to get away from everything for a few days. Work had been a mess. My personal life wasn't much better, and I needed space. That's what I told myself. But deep down, I knew why I chose this place. It had been 6 years since I'd last been here. 6 years since the hunting trip that ended with me swearing I'd never come back. I had pushed the memories down, buried them under logic. Told myself I had overreacted, That fear had twisted things in my head. But now, standing in front of the cabin again, I felt it all come back. It looked exactly the same. The same sagging roof, the same weathered logs, the same tiny porch with a single wooden step. The door was still painted a dull, faded red, chipped at the edges from time and weather. The woods around it were just as thick, just as quiet. I shut off the engine and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. The air outside was still, too still. No wind, no birds. The silence pressed in, heavy and unnatural. I forced myself to move, grabbed my duffel bag from the passenger seat and stepped out. The dirt crunched under my boots, and the sound felt too loud in the empty space. The air smelled damp, thick with the scent of wet wood and earth. The key was right where I remembered, under a loose board on the porch. I slid it into the lock and turned. The door stuck for a second before groaning open. Inside, the air was stale. The cabin was small, just one room. A bed against the far wall, a wood stove in the corner, a small kitchenette with a propane burner and an old metal sink, a single wooden chair, a table covered in dust. Everything was just as I had left it. I set my bag down and walked to the window. The same glass warped at the edges. The same view, nothing but trees pressing in from all sides. It had been 6 years, but nothing had changed. I shook off the feeling and started unpacking. Clothes, food, my hunting rifle. The familiar routine helped settle my nerves. I kept telling myself there was nothing to be afraid of, that this time would be different. By the time I finished, the sun was starting to set. The cabin had no electricity, just an old oil lantern and a few candles. I lit one, its flickering glow casting long shadows across the wooden walls. I made a quick dinner, canned soup heated over the propane burner, then sat by the wood stove, listening to the fire crackle. That's when I heard it. A sound from outside, a faint crunch of leaves. I froze. It was small, almost nothing. Could have been an animal. A rabbit, maybe. A fox. But it was too familiar. I set my bowl down and stood up. Moved slowly to the window, careful not to make a sound. The trees were dark, the branches shifting slightly in the wind. Nothing moved. I waited. A minute passed 2. Nothing. I turned away, trying to push down the unease curling in my stomach. I had let this place get into my head. I wasn't going to do this again. I went to bed early, but I didn't sleep well. Every noise made my eyes snap open. The creak of the cabin settling, the whisper of wind against the roof. I kept thinking I heard something outside, just beyond the walls. At some point, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off. I woke up to silence. The fire had burned down to embers, the air cold against my face. I rolled over, pulling the blanket tighter. Then I saw it. The window. The latch was undone. I sat up fast, my pulse hammering. I was sure I had locked it. I had checked. I climbed out of bed slowly, my breath shallow. Stepped toward the window, trying not to make a sound. Outside, the trees stood still. Just a wall of blackness. I reached out and pressed the latch back into place. Then I checked the door. Still locked. I told myself I had forgotten, that I was just imagining things. But I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I walked around the cabin, checking the ground. The dirt was damp, perfect for tracks. I found them, just a few feet from the porch. Footprints. Human. They led from the tree line to the cabin. And then they stopped. No return tracks. Just one set, coming in. I stared at them, my stomach twisting. Someone had been here, standing outside my cabin in the middle of the night, watching. I should have left right then, but I didn't. I told myself it was just some hiker who had gotten turned around, that they had seen the cabin, come closer to check it out, then left. I forced myself to believe that. I spent the rest of the day trying to shake the feeling. I went for a long hike, forced myself to focus on anything else. By the time I got back, The sun was already low. The cabin felt different now. Smaller, like the walls were pressing in. I locked the door the second I stepped inside. Double-checked the window latch. Pushed the chair against the door. Then I sat by the fire, gripping my rifle and waited. Hours passed. Nothing. The fire burned low. The cabin was quiet. Then a sound. Soft. Almost nothing. But close. Just outside the window. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. The sound came again. A slow, deliberate press of weight against the wooden porch. Then another. And another. Someone was on the porch. Standing just on the other side of the door. I gripped my rifle tighter, heart hammering. The floor creaked. Then silence. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, muscles locked, barely breathing. When the sun finally started to rise, I moved. Slowly, carefully. I reached out and unlatched the window. Then I looked outside. The porch was empty, but on the ground, just outside the door, more footprints, leading away from the cabin. I packed my things in less than 5 minutes. Threw everything into my truck. Didn't bother checking if I left anything behind. I didn't look back as I drove away. Didn't stop until I was miles down the road. The cabin nothing but a memory in my rearview mirror. I don't know who it was. I don't want to know. But I do know one thing. I wasn't alone out there. And whoever was watching me, they never left.